Hello there and welcome to Music Design. In this episode, the SNES game Plok and its song Akrillic will be our main point of discussion. Plok was released in 1993 and is a wildly colorful and wacky platformer title. Brother composers Tim and Geoff Follin were the two responsible for the equally wild soundtrack. The tune Akrillic is one of the main gameplay tracks. Tim and Geoff are noted for pushing the boundaries of the system's audio system, as well as crafting heavily complex songs that often take long forms. Our brother composers will show us how to create uncommon Prog chord progressions, fun panning and effects usage, and wacky lead instruments. Because of the relatively fast-paced nature of the game, Akrillic moves at an equally fast pace, holding at 162 beats per minute. While the song starts out in 4/4 time in the beginning, the tune diverges into a more complex meter beginning in section 2, which is apt for progressive rock music like this. Now, gazing at the overall structure of the song, it's quite long for a video game loop at around 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The song itself is also divided into 5 sections, although section 1 will have many subsections. The instruments are incredibly varied. Drums and bass are very much constant throughout the entire song. Marimba, organ, and the synth brass are used mainly in sections 1 and 2. And then we also have the ghost voice, Tron strings, flute, Theremin lead, and then the square fill out the rest of the instruments. Starting out with the intro, we will see the prominence of the drums, sort of like you would see in a traditional rock song. The hi-hats introduce us to the main beat of the song, and then additional this snare fill at the end to transition us to the next half. Of course, the main lead instrument in the song is, strangely enough, the marimba. The composers seem to have borrowed many influences in this song to be able to combine a marimba with an upbeat prog rock song. The melody itself is divided into 2, a low melody and a high melody, each with a slightly different rhythm and timing than the other. Notice the phrase repetition in both, where you see this first half right here and then the second half within this measure right there. Now the bass enters in the second half of this intro, which just copies the lower melody of this marimba. And then lastly, the flute just trickles down the E minor scale. In section 1A, while the drums, bass, and marimba remain unchanged, an organ and synth brass are introduced. Now, looking at the lead organ first, we can divide this entire melody into 3 sections. So that's the first section with these notes, and then this is the variation on that same phrase. And then we have this third section, which is a short B section. All 3 sections are repeated again in this following half of this section. Now the synth brass offers a different syncopation than the regular beat, as well as varying rhythmic patterns. Now the interval he uses here are thirds. This is one of the lessons we can learn from Tim and Geoff Follin. Using intervals of any degree will fill up the sound space in any song. So if your song is lacking, add intervals to your notes. The tune here takes a brief rest before transitioning us into the next section. One of the faults composers may have is having their song at the same dynamic level throughout. This is a grievous error, especially in an overworld loop song like this one. The melody fill here, which is actually quite interesting, is the introduction of one of the many Prog-inspired sections in the song. The toms in the drums perfectly line up with the bass, the marimba, and the organ, and they all act as one unit. So let me play the entire intro, first section, and transition so you can see them all together. Very similar to section 1A, but the synth brass has a new rhythm to distinguish itself. As you can see, it's very similar, but it increases the tension by having these notes rise up after every measure or so. Now, the only other instrument added here is the ghost voice, which copies exactly what this organ and the low marimba pattern we had in the beginning here. Which leads us into transition 2. Now this transition has a bit of an ending which prepares us for section 2, which is very different from what we've been listening so far. So, section 2. So what about this makes this sound prog rock? Well, one thing we can point to are the drums. They are either kicking and crashing at every accent point, or providing a snare or a tom fill. The bass also has a very cool sliding down melody. Now this type of melody is very much natural to what a real bass player would come up with. Again, it isn't too special as it only descends down the E minor scale. The organ too goes up and down the E minor scale using eighth notes. The synth brass is the most complex, but here I'm basically just copying this top line down an octave and then another third interval down. So basically we get this big open sound by just copying down notes. Now the song suddenly shifts up 3 half steps in the key of G sharp when we reach this section, which is another indicator of a prog rock song. So let me play the entire section over again. Section 3 is a huge, massive section, as you can quite well see in these big block chords in the synth brass and organ. Let's take a look at them first. The synth brass may look incredibly complex, but breaking it down, this first chord is an F in second inversion. Now, if we keep the same chord shape and just move it to different keys, we have a new chord right here. Then keep the same shape, and again keep moving it around the keyboard. Now you may have tried this before, but it may have sounded a bit weird to play the same shape on different keys. But by having every instrument correspond to these odd chord changes, it makes the whole thing sound more epic. The other grey notes you see here are other instruments using the exact same chord shape, just pitched in different octaves. Nearly all the instruments fade out at the end here, while fading back in this marimba melody from the intro. think of section 1C as the chill section. All of the instruments are softer and take up less volume. I assume this was done so that the listener could have a bit of a rest from the previous section. The drum beat is altered a bit, but not quite the same energetic pace it had in the beginning. Now during the first part in this section, both the bass and the flute double exactly what the low marimba melody was playing. Another lesson we can learn here is how to create memorable melodies. Having only one instrument play a melody can tire the listener out, but Tim and Geoff Follin utilize a total of 4 other instruments in just one song. The second half of this section breaks the flutes away from that melody and lets them solo a bit in the key of B minor. Nothing too fancy for soloing, just an up and down and around in this scale. In section 1D, the Tron strings are used, which is a mix of regular strings and an instrument called a Mellotron. In this context, it gives the song a mysterious and odd vibe, as well as sort of mournful. It uses that same chord shape I mentioned earlier, but this time we use E minor in second inversion. And then move one note down in each measure. At this point in the song, we start to pick up the intensity. The synth brass return, which include a cool panning effect. Every 2 notes you hear will be in the opposite ear. Now I accomplished this by manually adjusting the automation, as you can see here. So this top portion is in the right ear and the bottom is in the left ear, and then you can switch back and forth. After a few measures of that, my favorite instrument in this song is the Theremin lead. Let's take a look at how the Follin brothers compose a lead in the song. Now before looking at the notes, take note of how I adjusted both the vibrato as well as the glide time. Now this white portion you see here is the vibrato. As you can see, when it's on the bottom, there's no vibrato, but when it's on the top, that's when it's enabled. And then I adjust the glide time in this, right here. So as you can see, when we go up here, I increase the amount of glide time the guitar uses. Now if you wanted to know how to adjust the glide time, let me show you. So when you pick an instrument, head to the main page, and then you should see the glide option slider to the right here. So what you want to do is select right click and then MIDI CC learn. And then with that enabled, we can go over in FL Studio to generators under the current project, and then find the Omnisphere, and then go down to the CCs. And then you can pretty much select any of the MIDI CCs you want to. And then to adjust this, you just select one and just adjust. And then you can see how this affects the slider on the right. And then you can just use the create automation clip, and that's how it's done. You can adjust it through here. Tim and Geoff Follin definitely have good sensibilities and know that often the simpler the lead melody is, the better. Don't make leads that are too complex where the listener cannot comprehend what is happening. Overall, I'd say the best way to get your lead sounding authentic is first, record yourself playing the actual lead. Second, use vibrato and other adjustments to provide interest. And lastly, just throw out the music theory you know and play solely on your emotion. Before we move on, let's take a look at how much the composer actually copies and pastes the drum, bass, and brass loops. As you can see here, they're all the same patterns throughout this entire long section. While I personally would try to include at least some variation every so often, this just goes to show that a solid lead instrument can distract the listener from a repetitive loop. Section 4 is the last Prog-inspired chord section. Just like in section 3, the chord shapes stay the same, but move diatonically up and down. The drums continue in their same crash, kick, and fill. The conclusion of the song before the loop points is the most tension-filled. Every instrument combines on these two big hits, right here. And then afterward we have both the marimba and the synth brass trill on these two notes in the middle. And this continues for 4 measures until the loop. So now I'll play this section. Alright, I'll leave you all with the final playthrough of Akrillic from Plok. This song was fun to try and dissect, as it has many nuances that make it difficult for me to replicate it by ear. But I hope you enjoyed this faithful recreation of this great song. Thank you for listening.